Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence. All right, folks, welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. I'm your host, Shane Lemaster, and we're here for episode number 64 with very special guest, Dr. Dennis McKenna. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you, Shane. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Mm-hmm. And as I was just saying right before we got started, it's kind of a full circle thing for me to have you here. You're one of my heroes in the field of consciousness and psychedelics in general. I met you in 2017 at a psychedelic symposium in Boulder at the Boulder Theater. Had you sign my book, Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, which became really influential for me. A lot of parallels between myself and my brother. So thank you again for coming to the show.
I'm happy to come on your show. I remember the Boulder event very well. It was a lot of fun.
So the first question is the only real standardized question that I have, and I ask it to all my guests, and that is, the show's name is Conversations with the Mind. So what does that phrase mean to you? How does it land with you? Maybe what sort of images or constructs come to mind when you hear the phrase Conversations with the Mind?
Conversations with the mind. Well, you could interpret that any number of ways. I mean, it seems to me like all conversations are with the mind in a certain sense. We could unpack this lots of different ways, but conversation implies more than one. You've got at least two people conversing. Hopefully mind is in there somewhere, or otherwise it's just gibberish, and God knows there are plenty of conversations like that. But hopefully ours will rise to a somewhat higher level, hopefully a much higher level. And yeah, so that's about all I can say about it. But yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, these conversations, hopefully within our own minds, are constructive in a way that are, facilitating some kind of growth or evolution. But certainly, like you said, I have a sense that some of those conversations or the voices at the table might be, misguided or directed more towards, addictive personalities for me personally, or things like that too. So, but welcoming all aspects of ourselves to this table, and sort of taking an executive functioning over that.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Interesting. I was wondering if you would do me the pleasure of maybe reliving a little bit and maybe unpacking one of your biggest consciousness manifesting experiences. I mean, you have vast experience across a number of traditions and philosophies and things like that, and maybe one that particularly sticks out to you as like, wow, this is what consciousness is all about.
Well, it's hard to pick out a specific trip or experience that exemplifies all of that. I mean, there have been quite a few over the years, and and I can't really point to any particular one that. Well, maybe I could. Maybe I could say that the first time I took ayahuasca with the UDV happened in 1991, and you probably heard me talk about this before. But I took it in a group. It was in one of their temples. There were about 500 people in the temple, all taking ayahuasca at this time. It was after a symposium that we'd done with the UDV, and a kind of a scientific symposium, which was unheard of in those days, but we did it. And then I at the end of the symposium, they wanted everyone to, experience their sacrament as they understand it. That was for them, that was the big deal. They wanted all the foreigners that they'd invited to have the experience. And it was a great experience. I was blessed because I didn't have to pay attention. Everybody was speaking Portuguese, so I felt quite free to just go deep, and not really paying attention to what was going on around me. And I just went deep. And that was when I was granted this vision of photosynthesis by the plant, which you probably heard me talk about. It changed my life in a lot of ways. It helped me understand the importance of plants on a really visceral level. I mean, I experienced, what it was to be a water molecule and, involved in this process of photosynthesis, which is really kind of a miracle when you think about it. This is what's keeping life on the planet. This is what's sustaining life on the planet is photosynthesis. Everything else on the planet are parasites on green plants and other things that make their own food. We're parasites, with not necessarily in a bad sense, but we do depend on them. And if it weren't for the plants, we wouldn't be here. And in fact, no life would be on the planet. So when I say, you monkeys only think you're running things, the other side of that message is the plants are running things, and they really are running things. And so that was brought home to me in a very personal way, and it was, I mean, it's hard to describe a sort of a romp through the steps of photosynthesis, the biochemical roller coaster ride that is photosynthesis. And I was on that roller coaster. And, it was an amazing ride. It's hard to characterize it as a mystical experience. People say, what? You're talking about a biochemical process here. But it was a mystical experience for me. It was really very meaningful. And it was kind of the point where I really got the lesson about the role that plants play and the sustainability of life on Earth. And also it was all tied into, the Amazon and what we are, the concerns for saving the Amazon. It hasn't gotten any better ever since, but I mean, hopefully some people have woken up, although sometimes I wonder, unfortunately the people that control, environmental policy in Brazil are not responsible. And in fact, I'm very dismayed by Bolsonaro. He's taking a page from Trump in terms of basically just denying that there is a environmental, crisis in the Amazon. But there is, and anyone who looks at that objectively can see that there is. And the Amazon's under deep threat. And, my experience was 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. It was 1991. So I was hoping that, that the wake-up call that I was hoping would happen, that experience made me hope for, really hasn't happened. And that's very disturbing to me. I have been a optimistic person about all of these global environmental issues, that, we have enough time, we can turn it around, but people have got to wake up. And I've always said that the plants, these psychedelic plants, are catalysts for waking up the monkeys. they have worked to a certain extent. I mean, lots of monkeys have been woken up, not enough, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I'm honestly, you know, I am a bit pessimistic these days.
I have heard you speak about that experience, and I think, didn't you write about that experience in particular in your book?
Yes, yeah,
Okay,
I
yeah.
did write about it.
So
That's the one.
yeah, so for the listeners out there, an
Yeah.
amazing book. So after I read that passage in your book, and it's so amazing, I can't even imagine having a group ceremony with 500 people. The collective energy must have been so intense. But after reading that and after hearing you speak about it, I had also an ayahuasca experience in which I was touching a tree, and I was able to manifest um, almost exactly how you described it, you know, feeling what it was like to be the tree, to see history and time unfold in a completely different time scale than we think of as human beings, seeing
Hmm.
the interactions and the messages that the plants are trying to communicate with us, and then also applying that same type of technique to my inner inside my body. So, you know, zooming down into the size of a blood cell and traveling through the entire body to all the different systems, seeing how they communicate with each other. And the, you know, I'm not a chemist. I have basic knowledge of body systems, you know, with my psychology background, but I was able to see like these processes and these communications unfold and just
Hmm.
gain a much deeper understanding of you know, the interconnectedness. And where do you think, and I see it also, you know, there's kind of like this fall away, especially in Western society, falling away from even a desire to want to explore one's own consciousness, which I believe is maybe our most fundamental gift that we're given. um, but also I see a reawakening in some sectors, you know, with the psychedelic renaissance and things. So I'm hopeful in some ways, but also I'm wondering, like, where did we go wrong? Where was our fall from? Where did we fall from the mystical? We used to be cultures rich in mystical experience and spiritual experience, and that was like the foundation of our societies, and we've gotten away from that here in the West.
Hmm. Well, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one thing that's interesting about these substances is you don't have to be a biochemist, you know, to have these kinds of experiences. I mean, when I had my photosynthesis experience, I had plenty of courses in plant biochemistry because that was, you know, that was what I studied, and so there was a framework for it. On the other hand, I think that these things are, you know, if you're familiar with the writings of Simon Powell,
Hmm.
uh, you know, he makes a very good point, which is that psychedelics are lenses for looking at reality, you know, through from a slightly different perspective, and they facilitate your insights into the way things work, basically. That you know, they're always there, but we push them into the background. So psychedelics can be used to train a person almost as though like a microscope or a telescope. They give you a lens through which you can observe phenomena and you can understand things about them that you never noticed before. And once you notice them, they're always there. You know, I mean, these are not delusions, these are real things, but we're trained to suppress things, put them in the background. And you can look at experiences like Carrie Mullis, for example, the molecular biologist who, you know, he invented the polymerase chain reaction, which revolutionized molecular biology,
Hmm.
and he got the Nobel Prize for that. And he is very upfront. He's not embarrassed at all to say LSD is what gave him the insight. LSD is what
Hmm.
enabled him to get down with the molecules, as he puts it. and see what was going on. And so it's a real it's a real thing. It's a real instrument of discovery. And I think, you know, that's an important application of these things, is to apply it to understanding of the natural world. You know, we tend to, when we think about psychedelics, we tend to, like we do with everything, we put things into boxes, right?
Mhm.
We say, oh, it's got to be about mystical experience, it's got to be about spiritual experience, it has to be this or that or the other thing. Well, that's all very well, but psychedelics are their own thing, you know, and they can be many things. I mean, the experience I had with photosynthesis, I would not call a mystical experience. I mean,
Mhm.
it was a biological experience. It was an appreciation of the way that life worked, you know, and I guess you could call that mystical, but that, you know, that would be the first word I'd apply to it. It was actually an apprehension of a phenomenon in nature, which happens all around us and every day, and we just never notice it, you know. But it's profound when you think about it, that this is the process that captures energy out of space, energy of the sun, and actually harvests that light energy through these light harvesting pigments, and then uses that energy to create chemistry. I mean,
Mhm.
that's a alchemical process.
Mhm.
And when you think about it, I mean, it's biological. There's nothing miraculous about it, you know, except that life itself is miraculous,
Mhm.
you
Yeah.
know. So it's an instantiation of that. So I think that, you know, I would like to see more of that. I think, you know, I think that psychedelics are, you know, not given their due in some ways in terms of their potential, because of our tendency to put them into a box. They're either for spiritual experience or they're for therapeutic uses. Um, and there's nothing wrong with either of those two things, but they're not
Mhm.
limited to that,
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
know.
And I found also, language doesn't do these types of experiences justice anyway. So applying language seems almost futile, although it gives us a little bit of a base understanding to be able to share collectively these experiences. But I've also, I've used psychedelics for performance enhancement. I'm a professional jujitsu athlete, so I've competed on microdoses and things like that, and creativity, and we're learning that it's boosting neurogenesis and learning and all these great brain things. And I love how you're talking about the brain. And well, these are tools in and of themselves, but our brain and our body itself is a tool. And I think if we can start to think about it as a tool, then we can start to utilize it in those ways rather than identifying too much with the body. I've heard you talk about the brain being like a filter for reality. um, and how psychedelics open up those floodgates a bit more and allow more connections, and allow us to see those things that are already present. And with your photosynthesis experience, what sort of unfolding understanding have you gained about, if the plants are cultivating us and ruling over us, they must be like the primary form of consciousness maybe on this planet, or maybe the planet itself is a consciousness. So how does your understanding of the plants and the plant intelligence factor into how you conceptualize consciousness in general?
Well, I think, you know, like, again, it's this, you know, this inability to recognize intelligence in a certain way. I mean, in other words, the plants, you know, and many other things. I mean, I'm a believer in Gaia, and the
Mhm.
whole Gaia idea that the biosphere as a whole is this community. It's a superorganism. There's
Mhm.
actually a word for this in biology. You know, we are superorganisms too. We have our microbiome, almost 50% of our biomass is genetically not us. It's these microbial symbiotes that live with us. That's a super organism. Well, the biosphere is just an enormous super organism made up of the entire community of species. I think it is conscious, and not conscious in the way that we are, but probably super conscious in a certain way. And it responds. It's all about the Gaian community of species is all about preserving the planet in a preserving and maintaining conditions on the planet that are sustainable for life, and it regulates these processes on the global scale through feedback mechanisms and signal transduction processes that are not unlike something that goes on in an individual organisms, but these happen on the planetary scale. So, there are forms and forms of intelligence, and people, there is this presumption, you probably heard me talk about this, that there's this presumption that without brains, you can't have intelligence. That is not true. We're understanding it's not about brains per se, it's about hyperconnected networks. And the brain is a hyperconnected network of neurons, and obviously it can be intelligent. When it's not being dumb, it can be very intelligent, but you get these highly connected networks everywhere in nature. And Paul Stamets, for example, talks beautifully about the networks of mycelia and mycorrhizal relationships that link the old growth forest together, and essentially in a natural internet it's kind of a nervous system, but in that it's analogous to a nervous system in that it's a hyperconnected network that facilitates information exchange and helps the forest as an organism monitor the conditions that it's growing in and respond to them, respond to threats and so on. And, plants use chemistry to respond to threats in their environment or to adapt to adapt to the environment. Plants do all this through chemistry. Animals tend to do it through behavior. And you've heard me say, plants substitute biosynthesis for behavior. Plants are stuck in one place. They can't run away. So they have to deal with whatever their challenges are. They have to deal with it through, they don't have the option to get up and leave. So they have to deal with it, and they do that through chemistry. And so, in that sense, it's intelligence. There are different ways of thinking of intelligence, but the definition I like that applies to plants and these other organisms that we don't really think of as intelligence because they don't have brains, right? But do they optimize their relationships with their environment to maintain optimal conditions in the environment to support their life? If they do, then that's a kind of intelligence.
Far more intelligent than many of us.
And indeed it is, yeah. As we're learning to our detriment, we're not very good at adapting. And we're not very good at getting out of these habitual ways of thinking about things. And I think we're going to pay the price. We are, in fact, paying the price.
Yeah. I really like how you talk about intelligence, not in the sense of IQ or brain things, but more in the sense of this interconnected network of data sharing and information sharing to maximize homeostasis. And to me, that has been my experience, and that's what a lot of the studies with psychedelics are showing, is that they're enhancing our tool's ability to connect with itself. You know, it enhances this interconnectivity to a point where we can now transcend, you know, maybe more primitive behaviors, primitive thinking patterns, maladaptive thoughts, things like that, and hopefully transcend into these higher states of consciousness, which brings me into, you know, kind of segueing into talking with you a little bit about the Philosopher's Stone. And that's been conceptualized in lots of different traditions across history and time. I really like how you talk about the Philosopher's Stone in your book, specifically referring to the mushrooms and things like that, and being these catalysts, these you know, for lack of a better term, these magic molecules that help enhance already innate abilities that maybe we'd forgotten or lost. So maybe we could talk a little bit about the Philosopher's Stone as a concept as it relates to these things, especially in the wake of decriminalized Denver, you know, with the decriminalized mushroom movement. And I want to let you know, I actually just found this out last week, the day before Christmas. I was selected to be one of 10 members on the first ever psilocybin mushroom policy review panel in Denver.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh.
So I'll be reporting directly to the mayor about psilocybin and reporting to him about the effects of decriminalization, training law enforcement in our area as far as how to handle situations like this and what their focus should be on. So this is all kind of in the wake of this movement in mushrooms, and another great reason why you're here today, because, you know, I consider you a father of contemporary mushrooms in the U.S.
Is this for Fort Collins or Denver? Or
the policy review board is for Denver because it's decriminalized there so far.
Yeah. Is are psilocybin mushrooms going to be on the ballot this November in Colorado?
I think we're trying to hopefully get it more statewide, or in at least some more municipalities throughout the state. Fort Collins right now has a group through the CSU Psychedelic Club that's trying to get people banded together for petitioning a decriminalize in Fort Collins. So that'd be great. Yeah.
Well, that's good. That's good. It's very encouraging to see this. It's unfortunate that it has to happen this way, in a sense, but then, you know, I mean, you would think there would be a little more clarity at a higher governmental level about, you know, reforming the policy, reforming the understanding of these things. That, you know, it has to happen apparently city by city. You know, it has to happen locally, and maybe that's the way it should be, but it, you know, it frustrates those of us who would like to see it happen faster. But at least it's happening. And, you know, I think that, you know, the initiatives in Oregon and California in November, I think they have a good chance of passing, and that's going to change the conversation. I mean, the whole thing, you know, what I am saying about this conversation about decriminalization is the very idea that you could criminalize any organism, that you could just declare it, that it has no right to exist. I mean, who gave us that authority?
Who do we think we are?
I mean, we if anything, we should be looking at ourselves. You know, we're the ones that are screwing things up on this planet. You know, do we have the right to exist? Well, there's nobody around to tell us that we can't, and nobody, you know, to make laws that says, you know, humans are, you know, dangerous controlled substances and shouldn't be allowed. You know, and just this whole attitude about criminalizing these plants and fungi that have existed, you know, as symbiotes of the human species for tens of thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, maybe even longer. I mean, it's absurd on the face of it. And so I think as a political statement, as an assertion of human rights, we should assert the right to form symbioses. Symbiosis should be stated as a basic human right because it involves partnerships with things that are not human. It should be asserted as a basic right of any living thing. People should have the authority. They shouldn't have to ask, I guess is the question. They have the right to form these alliances as they always have. Now, sure, there are regulatory issues. The issues should be, not whether people have a right to use these substances. The focus has got to be on, there are quality issues, right? And that should be paid attention to. That should be regulated. There are educational issues, the whole thing that we're now learning after 40 years of the failed drug war, the thing that we're now learning is that it's education that is the answer, not prohibition. We need to learn how to use these things properly, and there's plenty of ways to do that. There's lots of information, and people just have to, learn to make informed choices about which substances they use, how they use them, and so on. But that should be up to the individual to decide. And hopefully with the help of this accumulated body of knowledge that we have, because even though psychedelics have been technically prohibited since the end of the 60s, they've never gone away, and now they're coming back and they're suddenly more popular again. But the thing is, in that 40-year span, we've learned a lot about how to use these things. So in the 60s, there was no accepted, body of knowledge about the proper way to use these things. Nobody really had any idea. We look to the indigenous traditions for guidelines, and that's obvious. If you want to learn how to use psychedelics, talk to the people that have used them for 10,000 years. They probably know a thing or two, but you don't need an FDA. You don't need that kind of regulation. You certainly don't need prohibition. None of these things are helpful to solving the problem. So, if you look at this in terms of how do we are in a symbiotic relationship with these things. It's not for nothing that indigenous people call these plant teachers. We learn from them, whether the plant teachers, actually, have a message for us, or whether they unlock a part of our mind where, the truth is there. We just didn't know about it before. It doesn't really matter. The point is the information good? And, if you're involved in these kinds of relationships, that's what you want to get out of it. So in that sense, you brought up initially the idea of the Philosopher's Stone, and sort of we've drifted away from that topic, but we can come back to it, because I do think that really that's what these things are in a certain sense. They are just a technology. They're a technology for learning about our world, about ourselves, about the mind, consciousness, about nature, how nature works. They really are an instrument. And depending on where you shine the light, they have different applications. I mean, you might shine the light onto yourself. You might use them to examine your own issues, that maybe, your depression or your, relationships, all of the psychotherapeutic applications. But the psychedelics are not limited to that. That's a small slice of what we can learn from these things. And so I think that the prohibition And criminalization model just doesn't work. We've shown that it doesn't work. So these decriminalization movements are very hopeful. The depressing part is that they were criminalized in the first place.
Yep.
You know, but finally, you know, we're beginning to correct that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't realize just, you know, in the course of time with humans, you know, we've been using these molecules for a lot longer than they've been prohibited. You know, I
Yeah,
think I've seen ethnographic or anthropological studies of human migration across the continents and how cannabis has followed the human migrations because humans have brought it along with them. And same with fungus and different species of mushrooms too. They've sort of symbiotically formed these you know, these beneficial relationships with humans, and humans know that, and they've taken them with them across their journeys across the continents. But bringing it back to the Philosopher's Stone, I agree with you. Education and knowledge, not only from these plant medicines and these teachers, is vital to hone in on, but also how do us who maybe are more initiated into this idea, how do we educate maybe the uninitiated? How do we talk to our kids about consciousness in this way to bring about greater awareness of plants and our role, not as dominators over the earth, but as, you know, servants of the earth? How do we
yeah,
educate?
as partners with nature.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's hard to have that conversation with people that have never taken psychedelics. I mean, this is the tricky part. You know, there are basically two kinds of people in this world: those who have been beyond the chrysanthemum and those who haven't. And it's very hard to have a conversation with the people that haven't. You can talk yourself till you're blue in the face. They will never get it. You know, all it takes, you know, is they have to have faith enough in themselves to, and courage enough to take a chance, you know, drink the cup, smoke the pipe, whatever it is, and then they can see for themselves. And it's like, you know, in trying to talk to people that haven't had the experience, it's almost, I mean, I've sort of come to say there's no point in even talking to you, you know, because you don't understand, and until you have the experience, you'll never understand. So we're just talking past each other here. There really isn't any point. But, you know, I could facilitate, you know, your experience, or I could put you in touch with the people that could do that. Then we can have that conversation, and it'll be a very different conversation. The, you know, I mean, the challenge is that the person who, you know, the person has to be open-minded enough to take that risk. And, you know, certain characteristic of the mindset that, you know, I would never touch a psychedelic. I mean, it's like, you know, okay, but number one, you don't know what you're missing, and number two, you are totally disqualified from discussing it.
Mhm. Yeah, I am a so I started my PhD in social work at Colorado State just last fall. Just made it through my first semester. Yay for um, so it's been a growth experience so far. And um, you know, we're talking about educating the uninitiated, and luckily, you know, the climate at CSU has changed, I think, since you've been there, and that's a really cool Colorado tie that you did work at CSU in the '70s, right?
Yes, yes. Well, in fact, I figured out how to grow the psilocybin mushrooms at CSU.
Mhm.
Fortunately, I had access to the tissue culture lab. I was a botany student, so the tissue culture lab was adjacent to the greenhouse. And as it happened, my best friend from high school was, and he's still a very good friend. He was my best friend from high school was in charge of the botany greenhouse at CSU at that time. And, you know, we were practically roommates. We didn't live together, but we lived in the same apartment And so I had access to the tissue culture lab, and at that time we were grappling with this question of how are we going to grow these critters, and this was like 1975, and then this interesting article came out from Michael Logia, and it was an article about how to grow Agaricus bisporus, the common table mushroom, in jars, in mason jars, of sterilized grain. All I did was take those techniques and apply them to psilocybin, and it worked like a charm, and that changed everything, and all that work was done. It was basically done at CSU because I had access to autoclaves and sterile fume hoods and all that stuff. So I bless CSU very much for contributing to the transformation of global consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have been able to do it if it hadn't been for CSU. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing, which I don't know if you are affiliated with the university, or are you? Do you have any?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a student in the social work PhD program. I'm also a graduate research assistant. But I think I mentioned this to you. I intend to do my dissertation on psychedelic assisted therapies, and to my knowledge, this is the only type of psychedelic project that's happened at CSU since maybe your time there. So really cool linkages there. I think that's really fascinating. And so far, I've gotten a lot of support, so they seem pretty open-minded.
Yeah, well, times have changed, and that's a good thing. But I was going to ask you, I don't know if you have any access to the botany greenhouse, but there was my friend Larry, the guy who managed the greenhouse. He planted a cutting of Banisteriopsis in the greenhouse. And just in the time I was there, it was getting quite large. And I'm just curious to know if it still might be there. Probably not. I don't know, but it would be interesting to know, because if it's still there, then it probably taken over the whole greenhouse. These things tend to get big,
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, so your advice too. I think I've spoken to you back and forth through email about my ideas for a dissertation, but it seems like, like you said before, the mystical experience with these molecules is not everything. It's not the only use, but it is a very profound transformational possibility for these types of molecules. And so the mystical has been, maybe studied longer than most other topics in philosophy across traditions. But nobody has really, at least in contemporary times, tried to look at precipitory factors that lead to mystical experience. And that's sort of what I'm hoping to explore in my dissertation with ketamine, because ketamine is legal here. We have a ketamine clinic locally. I'm part of, actually, have you heard of the Psychedelic Research and Training Institute up here in Fort Collins?
Excuse me?
What? Have you heard of the Psychedelic Research and Training Institute up here in Fort Collins?
No.
So directed by Dr. Scott Shannon, and out of the Wholeness Center, we're doing research now on ketamine therapies, hopefully psilocybin therapies here in the future, and also MDMA, things like that. So pratigroup.org, if you want to look it up. But my dissertation, focusing on this mystical experience. What are your insights? I mean, I know you've been to that place before. I know, once we've experienced it, we know for ourselves that place is real.
Right.
But, again, language does not do the mystical experience any justice, and it's difficult to study it scientifically. How might we go about looking at the precipitory factors so that maybe we can figure out how to give more people more of these experiences more frequently, if that's what they're seeking?
Yeah. Well, just hang on just a second. I have to,
Yeah,
I'm getting hot here and I got to turn the heater off.
sure.
I'm cloistered downstairs in my lair. It gets a little chilly sometimes, so now it's getting too hot. But anyway, I think, I mean, this is the conundrum, you know, and it's not only psychedelics, it's the conundrum that neuroscience faces, you know, in trying to study consciousness and any conscious state, you know. Um, um, you know, I mean, Johns Hopkins, as you know, they sort of are the leaders when it comes to studying psilocybin for spiritual applications, for mystical states, and so on. They're still limited by their instruments, you know, whether the instruments are a questionnaire that, you know, people might fill out to review their experiences, or a pre-experience, post-experience questionnaire or integration. Then you've got all the fancy toys, you've got fMRIs, you can put people, you know, into these machines and visualize what parts of the brain are activated when you take psilocybin, or what parts are suppressed, and you can make all sorts of statements about what's going on, you know, and those are all very interesting. You can say, well, obviously, you know, the cortex is activated, the amygdala is, you know, involved. You can make all these statements. You're still on the outside looking in, you know, and that's the conundrum that neuroscience is faced with. How do you bridge this seemingly insurmountable gulf between what you can observe externally in all sorts of ways and what you experience, you know, you know, and not just in drug states, but just in states of being conscious and awake, you know, your subjective experience of being in the moment. How do you cross that bridge? When are we going to be able to build a machine that, you know, can project your thoughts, your hallucinations out on a screen or whatever? I mean, we may never be able to get that. This is the tough nut in neuroscience. This is the toughest nut to crack. You know, we all know that consciousness exists. We don't always agree on what it is, but we can, you know, we can cite our own subjective experience as proof that some form of consciousness exists. You know it exists. I know it exists because we experience this. How do you describe that? Well, you know, number one, you're limited to words, so right there is a limitation. Science likes to quantify and measure things, you know, and within limits you can quantify your experiences. You can talk about the hallucinogen rating scale, and, you know, is it a 5 out of 10, and that sort of thing. And these are all very useful, but they, in some ways, they sort of miss the point, you know, because we're not able to, you know, we're not able to share. I can't get inside your head and experience what it is to be you. You can't get inside my head, except maybe, you know, on rare occasions when we take psychedelics, we can have shared what seems to be telepathy and so on. But again, you know, if you start talking to people about this, they start looking at you a little funny. You know, you know, maybe you need to step back from this a little bit, doctor. You know, so this is really the challenge for neuroscience, I think, in the 21st century. And it may be a holy grail that can never be achieved, to really bridge these two things. All the external measurements we can say, everything about how the brain works and so on, how do we link that to subjective experience of being in the moment,
Mm.
and I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's anybody who can nail that down, they will get many Nobel Prizes, I imagine. And yeah.
I think that's what we're all working towards. Yeah. But I think, our collective knowledge brings that together in this, in this life, in this living hallucination that we're all experiencing. And, I go back to, my question of how do we educate? How do we talk to the uninitiated? How do we talk to people about these experiences to make them relevant, even to those who make the choice not to imbibe a psychedelic medicine? And I tend to go towards similarities or trying to find connections. And so when I talk to folks who are uninitiated, I tend to ask them, have you ever spun around and gotten dizzy, or have you ever held your breath really long time? And like, these are all altered states.
Yeah.
Some of us have
Yeah.
spontaneous mystical experiences, but we all alter our state every day with caffeine, with sugar, with sex, with relationships, with video
Hmm.
games, with all these things. We're altering ourselves in every moment. And so I really like how Groff talks about non-ordinary states of consciousness as
Hmm.
just a catch-all term, because we're never really in a baseline state of consciousness. We're always altered by something in
Right.
our environment. And so trying
Right.
to connect on that level, then you're like, oh, well, these aren't so different. They're just, maybe a little more zeroed in, like you can get there much faster.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that's a good point. There is no, we're always in an altered state. We're always in a state.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily altered, but whatever state we happen to be in at the moment is a reflection of like our total neurochemical gestalt. Whatever's happening in our brains, whether we've introduced drugs into the picture or not. Because again, as you know, as I've often stated, we are made of drugs.
Hmm.
That's why drugs work. That's why they're fascinating to us, because they do interesting things, but they are just another variable that's affecting this sort of ongoing biochemical circus that's going on in your head all the time. And you can alter that in numerous ways, by holding your breath, by meditating, by, pressing your eyelids, by all of these things. You can induce altered states, or you can, the term isn't even accurate, but you can change your baseline state to some other place. And presumably there is some kind of baseline state that we think of as normal consciousness. you know um, and how do you talk to people about this? Well, it's hard. I mean something that most people have in common is dreams. You can talk about dreams because psychedelics often resemble dream like states. So if you need a common ground, you can tell people, well, haven't you ever had an impactful dream that really made a difference, that you woke up and you thought, wow, I really learned something there? So you can point to that, and you can point to mystical experiences. Another one, which some people achieve it through years of trying, of meditation and so on. And other people, they can take 25 milligrams of psilocybin and they're pretty much there. And so you don't have to be a saint. Anybody can have these experiences, and I guess how you talk to people about this is, well, it's just difficult. In the first place, they have to be interested enough that you can even have the conversation. And there's a tendency to dismiss that, in ordinary conversations. And the West, particularly, we're conditioned to devalue inner experiences. This is part of our problem. I mean, part of many we have many problems, but in the West, we tend to have a external focus, you know, on material things, on external stimuli, music, movies, that sort of thing, you know, but we look outside of ourselves for enlightenment, for wisdom and all that. Actually, we should be looking inside ourselves. And these psychedelics facilitate that process. It's like if they're mirrors, they let you turn the mirror on yourself, you know, and you can learn things. Hard to, you know, I mean, again, if you've had the experience, then it's easy to have the conversation. If you haven't had it, then, you know, how do you explain to somebody that, you know, I mean, it's very hard to explain it to the point where they will accept it. They tend to dismiss it. It makes them uncomfortable to talk about it, you know, because these are the realms of, you know, these things happen at the nexus where, you know, subjective experience, religious experience, psychotic experience, other forms of intoxication, and all kinds of comes together. And there's something about altered state that's inherently scary, you know, or people tend to think it's scary, you know, and so that makes it hard to talk about it too.
So if all goes well and, you know, freedom over consciousness is regained, and, you know, these things happen in our lifetime, we in the West, here in the US, are going to have to confront and consider the question of, you know, what is our culture of psychedelics? You know, and you talk about going back to, you know, getting basic structure and guidance and fundamentals from indigenous cultures who've been using them many thousands of years. I think that's great. But there's also a level of cultural appropriation that I don't think is appropriate within our cultural context. And I've seen it tried to applied numerous times unsuccessfully, whereas if you go to the Amazon in that cultural context, it's totally different. So we in the West here are going to have to ask ourselves, like, without stealing from anybody else's culture, what is our culture of psychedelic medicine, therapeutics, self-exploration, consciousness, freedom? How are we going to define that, and how are we going to create that container for our society so that we can finally, you know, step into our role in this bigger picture also?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a huge topic. This is a very important topic, because I totally agree with you. We can learn from indigenous people. We can even borrow some of the practices, but we need to recognize that we're not indigenous. What those practices mean to those folks is different than we might interpret them. I mean, we can learn from them, but I think you really hit the nail on the head. This is the challenge for post 21st century Western technologically oriented people. How are we going to develop these therapeutic or other paradigms for using psychedelics that actually fit in our society? We have to create something new. It can be a synthesis of indigenous practices and psychotherapeutic practices and maybe meditative practices. I mean, we can afford to be very eclectic here. We can integrate all these different traditions, whether they're indigenous or Eastern or, you know, Western mystical experiences, psychoanalytic. All of these things have something to contribute, because they're all disciplines. In a way, they're disciplines that have to they're disciplines for looking at consciousness, you know, and creating specific states of consciousness. So there's plenty to learn from, you know, and there's plenty, you know, and over time, over the last 40 years or so, we have begun to create these practices, you know, that work for us. Now, the decriminalization movement, I think, is very important for this, because right now, uh, technically these things are prohibited and they're illegal. And so that's just another thing that one has to deal with. But I think if they were decriminalized, and very lightly regulated, I think that what you would see, you would you would see in a lot of cases in many communities there are psychedelic groups, that do practice this stuff, and they do it very quietly. They do it underground because technically what they're doing is illegal. I think it would make a big difference if those groups could come out of the closet and say, yeah, we've been doing this. We have a psychedelic, interest group. We have ceremonies occasionally, and, people can join and learn how to use these things. I think it'd be a tremendous contribution to a community for centers like that to be able to offer, that kind of service, because people do need guidance. They don't need to be told how to use them. Well, maybe in a sense they need guidelines. There's a intelligent way to use them and a very thoughtless way to use them. We need to encourage intelligent, thoughtful use of them, and most people will get on board with that. So I think that this is a huge thing. This is our challenge. This is, in a way, it's a lot about what the McKenna Academy is all about. The reason I created the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy is to, address exactly this kind of thing. I wanted to be a mystery school in the tradition of Eleusis, but also very much a 21st century, place for learning about consciousness, about the substances, and about ourselves that can, not steal from other traditions, but acknowledge other traditions and use what works, with acknowledgement, and create new paradigms. And
Right.
that's the whole thing. And I think if there was a community of interested individuals, as there often are now, and some of them are kind of underground, some of them are not so underground, but I think it would be a tremendous benefit to the mental health of a community to do this. If there were a center where people could go for a weekend, whatever, to just get away from it all, why not even bring the kids, and have a weekend, go to it's like going to a spa, and you could get all those spa related mind-body restorative kind of treatments, but you'd also have the option to take psychedelics under, in a good set and setting. I think it would do a lot to heal this country.
Yeah, body, mind, and soul. And the way you describe it too, I think of, this synthesis almost and I think in martial arts terms a lot. So I think of Bruce Lee, coming to the US and respecting old ways, old traditions, but combining what worked, discarding what didn't work, and creating a whole new system that fit within the culture of the United States and what people wanted to learn at that time. I see this being sort of the same thing, this synthesis, but I really like how you have taught, how I've heard you talk about it before, as like maybe this idea of the betterment of the well, right?
The betterment of the well,
right?
yes.
That you don't have to be sick to benefit from these things, from these
right.
non-ordinary states. But maybe these non-ordinary states are keys to unlocking our ultimate inner healing potential. Most healing, or all healing, comes from within. It doesn't, we don't heal a cut from the external. We heal from the inside, physically.
Right.
It makes sense that that's how we would do it spiritually or psychologically as well.
Yeah. I think, there's a tendency to medicalize these things. Again, this is just stuffing them into a box that you they don't really fit, because sure, the medical applications are important. It's wonderful that there are therapeutics, therapeutic benefits from this for people that need it. But we all need, we're all high functioning people, not really sick, but we can benefit from what we can learn from these things. So betterment of the well, like any other practice, yoga or meditation or martial arts or exercise or anything, you don't do it because you're sick. You do it because you want to be a better person. Mm-hmm. And you see ways to improve it, and that's the way it should be practiced. And at the same time, if there were places in our society where people could go with no stigma, no risk of, breaking the law or anything, and no particular risk of, opprobrium, I guess, from the rest of society, if it's just an accepted thing to do, and nobody gets too twisted in a knot about it, I think that would do a lot to also take the pressure off the indigenous people. And, the ayahuasca tourism thing, mm-hmm. in some ways, it has positive aspects to it, but it also has negative aspects in that it's completely changing the culture. And, you can't, this is something that happens every time you get the dominant culture in, interfacing closely with a more fragile and indigenous culture. It's the indigenous culture that's going to lose in that equation. So people seek this ayahuasca tourism, or now mushroom tourism is also growing up. People go to these places because they are spiritually bereft. They are looking for a genuinely meaningful spiritual experience. They're not finding it in this culture. Religions are hollowed out. For very few people does religion actually provide any kind of spiritual, satisfaction. They tend to become rote, and they're more behavioral bludgeons than anything else. The last thing organized religion wants you to do is have a genuine mystical experience. That's very threatening to them. Mm-hmm. So we have to invent our own, and people go to different countries in search of these experiences, and it's a genuine impulse. It's a sincere impulse for genuine, meaningful experience. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that it has consequences when thousands of gringos go to South America and do it. Better if you could reverse that equation, mm-hmm. and you could say, you don't need to go to get these medicines. The medicines are here, mm-hmm. And bring the medicines from there to here, rather than people from here to there, mm-hmm. In the simplest way of thinking of this. Sure. And everybody would benefit more, I think. Sure. And, but, we have to get the absurd regulatory restrictions changed, and then that's possible. So that's what I would like to see. I think I'd like to see psychedelics societally evolve in that direction over the next few years. And we'll see if that happens. Yeah.
So I just have a couple more quick questions for you. I know I want to respect your time too. So first off, this is a wave. This is a wave of consciousness that's coming our way. And what do you see as like the potential futures of the human mind? I oftentimes contemplate this quite extensively, and I've even read accounts of anthropologists who postulate that as human beings, many hundreds of thousands of years ago, we might have had over 300 different senses within our body, whether it's telekinesis or control over matter, or walking through walls, or any number of senses that we may have just forgotten over time. They've been deprogrammed out of us, but they're still within our body. And I don't know, I see that the mind has all these potentials still there, just latent, and that we might be able to start accessing some of them. But what do you see? I mean, you've seen much more than I have. What do you see as some of the potentials of the future of the mind?
Well, um, I think, I think the, the sort of superficial answer, but nonetheless true answer, is that the potentials are limited, limitless,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and psychedelics are a way to learn how to use the mind, and in ways that, either we once knew and have forgotten, or in completely new ways. There are other disciplines to learn this too, and now with some of the newer technologies that we have, we can actually do things that uh, it was not possible to contemplate doing before that, like using neural networks and connections between brains and this sort of thing, human machine interfaces to maybe create actual systems of interaction that, if they're not telepathy, they're a damn good
Mm-hmm.
simulation of it, and that sort of thing, I think, will be possible. And I think this is part of the evolution of our mind. We're really at the beginning. I mean, psychedelics are ancient technologies, but we have newer technologies too. You can use those in conjunction with psychedelics, and I think you can get to some pretty amazing places, some interesting places. It remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have some
But
friends.
this is part of our evolution. I mean, aren't we trying to evolve ultimately into bodhisattvas,
Mm-hmm.
into enlightened beings? And we have to use all the tools we have to do that. And that's a desirable goal, I think.
Yeah, I think that was very well put. So last question, um, and it's just out of my basic curiosity. What is the most? I mean, you're on tour a lot. You go to different conferences. You travel a lot, and you talk to a lot of people. What is the most frequently asked question that you get? And also, do you ever get sick and tired of answering questions about your brother, or being asked questions about your brother?
Yes to both.
Yes.
Yeah, I sometimes get sick and tired. I'm not really sick and tired of it, because
Right.
people are curious, and they do think of us as a dyad in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes I sometimes, tongue in cheek a little bit, I tell people, how come he gets all this attention? He's been dead for 20 years. I'm still here. I'm still talking. I'm still kicking. How about a little respect? But ultimately, it's good. I mean, I have to say, to Terrence's credit, you know, he was so far ahead of his time. I mean, this is the thing that's consistently amazing to me, is that young people come to me at these conferences and so on, and they say, everything I know, I learned from your brother. Everything I know that I consider valuable, I learned from listening to your brother. And it's like, these people had to be in diapers if they were even alive when
Mm-hmm.
Terrence was at the height of his career. So I guess that's a testimony to how timely and timeless his rap was. I mean, he was way ahead of his time. And, what everybody's talking about now, the planetary crisis and all this, he was talking about this in the early 90s. And so it's very, he's achieved this strange immortality on the internet, and he's like this virtual sage, and people still want to hear what he has to say. So in a way, I don't really have to interpret it for him. I can say, go to YouTube. You want to
Mm-hmm.
hear what my brother said? Go to YouTube. You want to hear what I say? Come to my conferences. And it's a similar message, but not the same. So I do get tired of it, but I expect it, and it's okay. I know it comes from a good place in people's hearts, and what your other question is, what do I most get asked about that I'd rather not talk about? Hands down, the experiment at La Chorrera.
Okay.
Very difficult to discuss, and yeah, I don't particularly want to keep beating that dead horse, for all sorts of reasons. And it was a profound experience, but on reflection, I think that there, in theoretical terms, I don't think we learned a lot, as time goes on. A lot of the ideas that came to us at La Chorrera they're just not valid. They were delusional, essentially, with maybe a grain or two of truth mixed in somewhere in there. But I certainly don't regret the experiment at La Chorrera. It was a pivot point in my life, in our lives, that I would never, I would not go back. I would not change it. It is what happened. But on the other hand, it happened. I was only 20. Terrence was only 24. Most of our lives have been lived since then. And so I don't want to be the person who's famous for their psychosis in a certain way. I've made other contributions. So the experiment at La Chorrera comes up as a perpetual trope, but I prefer not to talk about it.
and you've written it all down in your book too, so
yeah, it's all there. If people want to unpack it, read the book. Yeah.
And I too, especially after reading this book, I too see you and your brother really as that dyad. You are two sides of the same coin, and the way you write about it in this book made me think about my bond with my own brother. We're only 18 months apart, but we're two very much like that. We complement each other in a lot of different ways. And so I want to say thank you for putting this book out. I had no idea what I was getting into when I read it, and it benefited me in so many ways beyond just what was on the pages. It's enhanced my relationship with my own brother and brought me more gratitude that he's still here with me and I can take advantage of that. So thank you very much.
Well, I am very happy to hear that, Shane. And unfortunately, I have to tell people they're all sold. I do not have a single copy of the Brotherhood to sell, and the stocks on Amazon are out. So the only way people can get it is in the form of the Kindle book. So they can still get that from Amazon. That will never. And somewhere in Hawaii, in somebody's garage, there's a box of 16 books. That's all that's left. I just mailed out my last copy today, or tomorrow I will mail it. So yeah, it's been a successful run. Now I'm looking into reprinting it or getting some kind of print on demand thing set up. But for right now, it's rare. It's hard to get, and the prices on Amazon are getting ridiculous. But that's the way it is.
So go get it on Kindle, right? If they want to see it.
Absolutely, you can get it on Kindle, I think. And then this one isn't out of print. This one is, and that's also a great book. Very different, but that one is available for sure.
So I'm also, I'll be going to the Consciousness Conference in Arizona next year where you'll be speaking. And I hope to be able to, buy you an iced tea or something and have you sign this collector's book that I bought, and just check in with you and see how everything's going then. So hopefully,
let's make a date of it. Yeah, I'll see you there.
Okay.
Looking forward.
And if anybody wants to, find more information about the things you're doing with the McKenna Academy or I don't know, are you still doing stuff with Symbio? If people want to reach out to you, how can they do that?
Symbio is pretty much a dead horse,
Okay.
but the www.mckenna.academy is a place to look. And then, of course, the Hefter Research Institute, which is, I'm still affiliated with it. Hefter's going through changes, but it's still very active. So that's HEFFTER.org. And you can look at the Hefter Institute as well. I'm not at the center of the research, but I'm a board member since 1993. And I go to the meetings, and I just, the young researchers have taken over, but they're doing great work. So still support that.
Awesome. Well, thank
Okay.
you again. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
And we'll see you in a couple months.
Yeah, very good interview.
Okay.
Let me know when it's posted, and I'll get it on our website.
Okay. It should be up in the next few days, but I'll let you know.
Okay, great.
Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work. We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.